Hi, welcome back to Mentor Monday. My name's Lisa Ireland. I'm an Australian author of contemporary fiction and I'm your writing BFF. If you are someone who's wanting to be published by a traditional publisher, I'm here to help you take your first steps on that journey. Or if you're a little bit further along the track, I'm here to hold your hand while you head towards your goal of being a published author. So last week we talked a little bit about who to take advice from and who not to, and I'm going to move on from that today, but maybe hark back to it a little bit during this video, just because today I'm going to talk about your writing process, and lots of people have opinions on that too, so I'm going to talk a little bit about who you should listen to when you are refining your writing process. So for starters, let's talk about what I mean when I say writing process. Your writing process is the method that you use, very simply, the method that you use to get the words from here onto the page. And I think a lot of us think that that's, before we start, we think that that's going to be quite easy, really. We've got these great ideas in our head. We've read lots of stories written by other authors, and we've often got very strong opinions about the way other authors have done it. We might, read books and be able to analyse the text and see where the author's gone wrong, and have some really strong opinions about how our book will work when we write it. But as most of you who've started out on this journey probably are well aware by now, the process of getting the words or the story that is in your head onto the page is anything but simple, because if it was simple, everyone would do it. Now, I guess this is where I hark back a little bit to last week's video and say, be careful who you take advice from. And I guess what I mean by that is process is not something that you can work out in a minute. It's not something that you necessarily even understand after you've written one whole book or two whole books, or in my case, 6 whole books. I've actually, like most of you, I've written more than the books that have been published. So as you become a published author, I know many of you will end up with some books that sit on your computer or in the bottom drawer, never to be actually seen again, or maybe to be remodeled later on in your career when you've got a bit more experience. But so what I'm saying is, even though I've got 6 published books, I've got more than 6 manuscripts. I've probably got about 10. And even after having written 10 books or 10 partial books, I'm still refining my process. So what types of processes do people have? Let's go through that. And if you talk to a lot of published authors, as many authors as there are, that's how many processes there are, really. Your process is individual to you. It's never going to be exactly the same as somebody else's. And that's a great thing, actually, because that's what makes our work unique. When you read a book, you and I could have a very similar idea, and often authors do have similar ideas, but when we write it, our technique, our voice, the way we view the world, that will make those 2 books, even if we were given exactly the same premise to write on, those 2 books would end up being very different. And it's the same with process. Even if we both go to the same professional development, if we both go to the same course and learn how to do it right, the way we interpret it, the way we work, will depend on our personalities, on our living situations, and just who we are and what works for us. So I guess my first point is, don't let anyone tell you you are doing it wrong. When it comes to process, the process that works is the one that works for you, the one that you're comfortable with, the one that gets the words on the page for you. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about things like some authors before they start writing, will do a very detailed outline. They will write down, everything they know that's going to happen in chapter by chapter almost, and they might research at the same time. This part of the process for them might take months or even a year, up to a year, where they nut out the book, they work out what's going to happen, they do all the research first, and work out the story questions as they're going along in their outline. And then when they sit down to actually write the book, they're writing from their outline. They know what's going to happen. It's not a surprise to them. They've already done all that work, and they're just concentrating on getting that onto the page. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to do a much looser outline, but still an outline. So you've got the bare bones of the story there, and you've worked out where your high points are. You've worked out where your turning points are in the story. You've worked out what's driving the story forward. You've worked out the crisis points. All of those things, the big moments, I guess, in the story have already been worked out, and usually you've got a really strong ending worked out. But all the sort of lovely bits in between, all the all the meat of the story is not worked out in the outline, and those writers will work that out as they write it. So they're still writing to an outline, but it's much looser, much more fluid, much more room for sort of veering perhaps off the track, and so but they do know where they're writing to. So they might sort of have like the first major turning point worked out, then the crisis worked out, the ending worked out, and they fill in the bits in between. And then there's other writers who we like to call pantsers, because they write by the seat of their pants, who just get a story idea and start to nut it out on the page. And you'll often hear those writers talking about the messy first draft or the dirty draft, because their first draft of their story is almost like their outline. So because they don't actually know where the story is going when they start, they might just have a theme that they're writing to, or they might have a character that is driving the story forward, and they're exploring this character's world and what happens to the particular character. So they don't exactly know when they start out what the story is going to be about, and they work that out on the page. And that usually results in quite a messy first draft, which then all the tidying up and all the tightening and making sure that those turning points that are crucial to making a commercial fiction story work, that all gets, sort of not retrofitted necessarily, because they might already be there, but they get heightened and tightened in the second and subsequent drafts. And there can be many, many, many drafts if you work that way. Of course, that is just a very broad generalisation of process. But what I wanted to say to you is you can do any of those three things or anything in between. If it works for you, that's your process and it works. There's nothing more creatively stifling than being told you have to write a particular way, particularly if doesn't come naturally to you. I'll never forget I was actually in a professional development session with my friend Rachel Johns and a whole group of other writers. And Rachel and I were seated we were in sort of like a conference room, and we were at a round table. So she was sitting on one side of the table and I was sitting on the other. And both Rachel and I, we have quite different processes. We're probably both more towards the end, and I'll as these videos go on, you'll get to hear more about my process, I guess. But both of us are more towards the pantsing end of the scale than the plotting, the very tightly outlined end of the scale. But be that as it may, we'd gone to hear someone speak who was going to tell us how to write a bestseller, and we were excited about this because who doesn't want to be a bestseller, let's face it. And at the beginning of this talk, the speaker told us that if we wanted to be bestsellers, there was one way to do it, and she knew how to do it, and she was going to tell us. And then she went on to outline her process, which I won't go into here. But I know Rachel and I both went from leaning in like this to I looked up after about 2 minutes, and both of us had sunk back into our chairs and put our pens and our notebooks on the table, because both of us by this stage were experienced enough to know that there is no one right way of doing this job. There's many, many ways to do it, and anyone that tells you otherwise is wrong. That's plain and simple. So I know many, many published authors, and I don't think that there's any two people I know, any two published writers that I know that go about it exactly the same way. They just don't. We all do it slightly differently. So I guess my message to you today is work out what works for you. And how do you know if it's working? You know if it's working if you're coming to the page every day with a sense of excitement when the words are flowing. And when I say the words are flowing, I don't mean that you never have to stop and think, or that you never have to work out a plot problem, or that everything is absolutely perfect, because we all have good days and bad days writing wise. We all have things that we didn't anticipate when we first started out to write the book, or problems that get thrown at us when we realise that actually in law that's not actually the thing that we've worked out to be this great plot point isn't actually possible. But there's usually workarounds somehow. But what I mean is, if you are going to the page every day, or most days, you're feeling excited to write the story, the words are coming, it's not like getting blood from a stone every single day, then that process is working for you and you should stick with it. If, however, every time you sit down to write the book, you are stuck, you find excuses not to work on your manuscript, you decide to clean out the pantry instead, or to fold the washing, or whatever, then maybe it's not this. It could be that the story is not working, but it could also be that your creative process isn't working for you, and it might be because you've been told by your writers group or by another writer who's successful that this is the way to do it, and you are trying to adhere to that person's process, and it just doesn't work for you. So I have 6 books, as I've said. I'm going to just briefly show them to you now, and I'm going to quickly talk about what I did, how I wrote each one, and then you are going to probably never listen to anything I say again, because you'll think I'm crazy, because each single one, the process has been slightly different. But I do want to assure you that by the end of The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, I think maybe I'm working out what my process is, or at least I know what it isn't. Okay, so the first one, this is actually an anthology, but it's the only print copy I've got of this book. My book is this one, Breaking the Drought. That was the very first book that I had published by Escape Publishing here in Australia. Now, that is a rural romance. I didn't know it was a rural romance when I started writing it, because I didn't know anything about the genre. That's the story for another day. So I wrote that book in this crazy way. It came to me in scenes, and actually there's a scene in sort of the first third of the book, but towards the middle of the book, which is set at a ball. And that was the first scene that I wrote, I think that was pretty much the first scene that I wrote. I wrote this book just as it came to me. And it was all over the place. I wrote the middle of the book first, then I realised something had to happen before that, because I'd started in the middle of a story. And so then I went back and wrote the start of the book. Then I'd write a bit more in the middle. Then I wrote the end, but I hadn't written the crisis. And so it was really, literally written in scenes. Because it was a romance, I knew the ending. Like, I knew that the couple were going to end up together, but I had no idea how I was going to make that happen. So I kind of knew what their conflict, or I definitely knew what their conflict was, but I didn't know how the story was going to pan out. That was a very difficult book for me to make work because of the way I wrote it. It took a long time to knit those scenes together seamlessly and to make it work as one cohesive story. I wouldn't recommend that method, But for some people, that method works really, really well. And I'm just trying to think. There was someone quite famous. I think. Oh, I'm not. I can't remember who it was, but I know there's a. I was going to say J.K. Rowling, but that's not right. It wasn't her. Anyway, I know. Oh, I know. It might have been the. Can't think of the author's name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That can work really well if you're that sort of person that sees scenes vividly and you're very creative, or it might maybe your mind is not linear and you like to work that way. I'm actually quite a linear person, so that wasn't a great method for me, and I don't know why I chose it, but I did it. This video is already longer than I expected it to be, but never mind. I'll quickly go through the next one. Now, I'd done a lot of professional development after I wrote, like before I wrote that book, while I was writing it, and after I wrote it, and I found out a lot about plotting, because a lot of people like to tell you about plotting. And so I knew then that I'd done my method was wrong for the first one. That's not how you do it. That's not how you write a book. I found out that how you write a book is you have to really tightly plot it, and you have to know everything that's going to happen beforehand, and you have to have there has to be a crisis, that there has to be a black moment, and you have to know what these are, and you have to plot really tightly. So that's how I wrote this book. This was the hardest book I've ever written. It was maybe The Art of Friendship, which I'll get to in a minute. But this was really quite difficult to write this book. I had no joy when I was writing it. I didn't love it when I wrote it, and it still causes me pain even to look at it. And it's not necessarily, people tell me that they love this book, so some people got a lot of enjoyment, and I'm glad that I wrote it. And the actual story I like, the actual idea of the story I like, but it caused me a lot of pain to write. And it took me longer than it normally takes me to write a book, because I really I didn't have joy when I sat down at the computer every day to write this book. And that's because that tight outlining, that's not my process. I didn't know that then, but I know it now. So it feels like I'm told that it's an okay kind of book, but I didn't have any joy writing it. Now, the next one, this is also, this is an anthology of, so my book in this is called Honey Hill House. This is an anthology that's got 3 books in it. So Jenny Jones's book is, I've forgotten the titles now. Goodness me. Heart Stuck on Hope is Jenny's. And then my book is Honey Hill House. And then there's a book by Catherine Evans called The Healing Season. We wrote these 3 books together. So they're individual stories, and each story stands alone, but the world is shared. And Kath, Jenny and I worked together to create the shared world. We wrote the stories to be, so they're not just chucked together, they all fit together like a series, but you can read them individually as standalone books. Now, the thing about this was, because the 3 of us were writing it together, and it was commissioned by Harlequin, there was quite a tight deadline. So we had to submit by a deadline, and I knew also that if I didn't keep to my commitment, my time commitment, that Jenny and Kath would be disadvantaged, because all 3 of us had to submit our stories at the same time. So that was probably the first book I had to write to a quite tight deadline, and that was how I discovered what works for me. Because I had to write it to a tight deadline, I didn't have time to outline. Like, we did a lot of the pre-work, so I thought a lot about the story, and I thought a lot about the characters and the shared universe. I knew the setting really well, because we'd spent a lot of time talking about the setting and the characters and the shared universe. So, but the story itself, I had the story idea, but I didn't exactly know how it was going to play out. Again, because it was a romance, I knew the ending, I knew the characters had to end up together, but I had no idea how I was going to make that happen. I really loved writing that book, because I just sat down every day and it took me on a wild ride. I didn't know where it was going or where the story was going. I was as surprised as the reader when things happened a certain way. technically, it's probably not my best book because I've learned more about writing since I wrote that book. But I still really love that story, and I think of it with great fondness. And for two reasons. One, because of the great time that I had writing the book, sharing that experience with two of my close friends. But the other is the joy that I had. Sorry, something's happened with my computer there. I hope that doesn't black out on the screen. Anyway, the great joy that I had in just having that really freedom of process just to write whatever I wanted. But I kind of thought that was an aberration. I didn't realise that was how I really liked to write. And so the next book that I started to write was another rural romance, and I tightly plotted it like I did with Feels Like Home because that's the right way to do it, I'd been told. And so I had this rural romance that I'd started to write, was very tightly plotted, and I went back to having that same feeling that I had when I was writing Feels Like Home, not wanting to come to the keyboard, feeling stuck, not having that freedom and that joy in writing. But I still, because I'm a slow learner, it didn't occur to me, I thought it was the story that was wrong. It didn't occur to me that it was my process that was holding me back. Anyway, I was so stuck that I was complaining to all my writing friends. And once again, Rachel had a good idea. She said to me, why don't you write something else? Like just have a break for a week or two and just write something, a passion project maybe, just to sort of free your creative process up a bit. And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I had this story hanging around in the back of my head for a few years that I'd wanted to write, but sort of didn't really have the storyline fully fleshed out. But I thought, okay, I'll give that one a go. I'll just sort of sit down at the keyboard and write the start of it, and hopefully by the end of, when a week or two, I will have got my creative juices going again, and I can go back to my rural romance. But that didn't happen. What happened was that I started this book and I loved writing it, and I got excited about writing again. And I think 120,000 words later, I stopped, and that book was The Shape of Us. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but my dog is sitting behind me, and every single time I record a video, she starts scratching herself. She never does this any other time, only when I'm recording a video. It's like a nervous tick. Anyway, so this book was written without an outline. I knew the characters really, really well in my head. I've been carrying them around for a really long time. I knew the subject matter because the subject matter is very close to my heart. So I knew a lot about the subject matter, but I didn't. The story itself just came out. So you'd think then that I would have refined my process and gone, okay, this is my process. But no. Again, after that, I had another tight deadline, which was to produce this book. I had a publisher deadline, and I only had a very rough idea about what was going to happen in this book. But I was afraid that if I just let my natural process go, that I wouldn't get the draft finished in time to send to the publisher. So I tightly plotted it, and I went back to that same feeling of being restrained, not wanting to write it, and it not turning out the way that I'd hoped it would. This book had the most edits of any of my books. I had to rewrite quite a lot of it. I had to put retrofit extra scenes into it to make it work. It's just, I think in the end we got there, but it took a lot of blood, sweat and tears, and again, not my process. However, this book, which is truly the book of my heart, this book, I'd been carrying around the idea and the characters, or the seeds for the characters, for quite a long time before I started it, 10 years or more. And I knew, like, I kind of had the idea for the road trip part of the story, which is written in the present day. I'd had that idea for, like I said, over 10 years. So I kind of knew what I wanted, although I didn't know how it would end. But then the backstory, I didn't know at all. And the secret of the title, The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan, I didn't know what the secret was until I got to it. I knew there was a secret, but I didn't know what it was until I actually got to it in the book. And I think for me, that has finally made me realize, like, I trusted myself. I had a bit of time to write this because I didn't have a deadline for it. I was out of contract after the previous book, and so it meant that I could take. I didn't have that pressure of a deadline pushing down on me. So I trusted myself to just, I trusted my characters and myself to just let the story develop the way it needed to. And I trusted that the secret would be revealed to me, and it was. So in a nutshell, I guess my advice to you is go with your heart. It might take you one book, it might take you 10 books to work out what your process is, but don't let somebody else tell you that your process is wrong. There are many things in writing that have a right or wrong answer. There are many things that you can learn, but in terms of process, it's about experimentation and about your heart, about how you feel when you're writing your book. So if you're comfortable, the words are coming, then lucky you've nutted it out, and don't let anyone deter you from that. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this very long Mentor Monday. It was only supposed to be 15 minutes and it's turned out to be closer to 30, so sorry about that. I hope I didn't lose you along the way. But I'll be back next week with a new topic, and don't forget that I will pop this up on my Facebook page as well as on the YouTube channel. You can comment either place, and if you've got a topic that you would burning for me to talk about, please let me know. Okay, see you next week. Bye.